Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Our program will get started momentarily. I see we still have some people joining audio, but for those of you who are here, please feel free to add your name and UC San Diego affiliation in the chat box. So are you an alum? What year? What college? Are you staff? Are you a community member? Are you a student? Let us know who's joining us today. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's session. We're still waiting for a few more people's audio to connect, but while we're waiting, please feel free to add your name and UC San Diego affiliation in the chat. We'd love to know who's joining us, and this will actually help our panelists today shape their conversation, their responses, so that we can try to cover a lot of ground. Next slide. And next slide. Our UC San Diego principles of community. The goals of these principles include to provide fair treatment for faculty, staff, and students, encourage a climate of fairness, cooperation, and professionalism, foster inclusive, respect, and welcoming environments, and promote collaborative attitudes and actions. Next slide. And I will pass it over to our moderator.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and hello, everyone. Welcome to Allyship in the Workplace. It's great to see so many of you here, and students, staff, and alum, and others. My name is Terence Mays, and I'm a proud alum of UCSD's Joint Doctoral Program in Education. I'm also a former staff member of UCSD. I currently work at Stanford Medicine as Associate Dean for Equity and Strategy. And, you know, allyship in the workplace is something that I think a lot about. And whether you're a student, I know a number of you are here, or if you're starting your career, you're a manager, leading a small team or even a large team, I believe that everyone has the capacity to advance allyship in the workplace, or really any environment. And, you know, I'm glad we're having this discussion today because, you know, in this current era of social justice and racial justice, the question that, excuse my voice, I have laryngitis. The question that I hear that I get most often really over the last few years is, you know, what can I do? You know, what can I do to make a difference? You know, I may not be directly impacted by this particular form of discrimination or oppression, but I want to do my part to support those who are. And that is exactly what we will discuss today. And this will be a conversation amongst panelists, but also with all of you. So I want to start, though, with the definitions that we are using around allyship, and you're seeing it on your screen now. You know, what is a workplace ally? You know, we are using this definition. A workplace ally is anyone that actively promotes and aspires to advance the culture of inclusion, and does so through intentional, positive, and conscious efforts that will benefit people as a whole. Again, anyone and everyone can be an ally in any environment. So I am thrilled to be joined today by a stellar cast of fellow Triton alumni whose allyship experiences really span multiple generations and industries. We have finance represented here, media, tech, entrepreneurship. They will share a bit about themselves, and but first let me just say their names and who they are. So we're joined by Tonya Menendez of 2009, co-founder and CEO of Snowball Wealth and Makers Row. We're joined also by Mickey Rosen, 89, board director Director and Advisor in Media, Tech, and E-commerce, and Ben Teicher, 86, President of Healthy Direction. So let's give sort of a virtual round of applause to our panelists. And I'll ask Tonya to kick us off and tell us a little bit about yourself. Tonya.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Tonya Menendez. I am the co-founder and CEO of Snowball Wealth. Snowball Wealth is an app for women to get free debt planning, do savings challenges, and learn how to build wealth. Prior to Snowball Wealth, I worked at Goldman Sachs, and I also co-founded another venture-backed startup tech business called Makers Row. I graduated from UCSD with a degree in sociology and in 2009, and from John Muir College, and I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, Tonya. How about we go to Ben?
Hi, everybody. It's a terrific honor to be here with you today on this tremendous subject. I'm currently the president of Healthy Directions, based now in Washington, D.C. I've been here on the East Coast for about 18 years. I grew up in Southern California, 1986 graduate of Revelle College. Met my wife at UCSD as well, so it's a very important place in my heart for many reasons. And I've had the great privilege over my career with working with some tremendous people and tremendous brands, including the Walt Disney Company, Nestle, Discovery Communications, and have spent the last several years working with entrepreneurs building their businesses. I also do serve on a few boards, a couple of nonprofit boards, and 2 private equity backed companies as well. And that's my story.
And it's a good one. Mickey.
Thanks, Terence. Okay, I'm unmuted. I don't want to do the you're on mute. I'm Mickey Rosen. I graduated from UCSD in 1989. Tonya is making me feel a little bit older, but I'm doing the best I can here. With a degree in economics. I started my career, really I characterize it as I built the foundation of my career with McKinsey and Company. I also went back for my MBA from Harvard. I then spent the next about 25 years as an executive, entrepreneur, and investor at the intersection of media, tech, and e-commerce. I've worked for large established companies like Disney, Fox, and Yahoo, as well as early stage companies when they were early stage companies, such as Hulu and Fandango. I currently advise companies and I serve on private nonprofit as well as public boards in the United States, Australia, and the UK. My sweet spot is growth companies in the space that I love, companies like Fabletics, which is revolutionizing e-commerce and fashion. I've been on the board of Pandora Media, and I also serve on boards of companies in transformation. So I recently joined, as an example, a board of a bank in Australia, because fintech is obviously completely changing how banking has been done. So the bottom line is I love areas of growth as well as disruption, and that's where I focus my career.
Thank you so much. So again, a stellar group, and I'm really honored to have an opportunity to have this conversation with you all. So let's jump right in. I want to ask you, what role has allyship played in your careers, your illustrious careers? What role has allyship played? Can you share any examples of where you've been a benefactor of allyship and also a beneficiary of allyship, and anyone who wants to jump in?
I'm happy to start. I've been less a beneficiary of allyship. Look, I grew up a privileged white person in Southern California, and from an early stage had a strong radar for what is right and wrong, and have learned some lessons from my desire to solve every problem I come across. And what I've learned from those lessons is allyship is not about jumping in and solving somebody else's problem, but supporting them. And I've learned a lot more how to listen and seek insight and seek their input. And it is also, a key foundational element of how I lead my businesses today, seeking input, seeking information, putting people around me who've got deep experience in what really matters, and using their insights and their knowledge to solve problems, but not jumping in and solving somebody else's problem. And I think, speaking as a white person, we think we know best what's right and wrong. We know how to solve everybody's problems, and that's just not true. We think we know what is right and just all of the time. But my approach, which I've refined over my career and my life, is again to seek out input from people to help them and get their support in me helping them solve problems.
Yeah, I think that's a really important foundational principle of allyship. Really is, allyship is about asking the question of others. How can I support you? Thank you for that, Ben. Anyone else? Mickey, I see you.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I think naturally being a beneficiary or benefactor of allyship, I think it to some degree it shifts over time. So I'm certainly happy to share how I've benefited from what I have learned, the term allyship. And, I think we have to set this in context. So when I first got into my full-time role with McKinsey, it was 1990, it was January 1990. And I was suddenly in an environment where the professional staff was about 95% male and about 95% white. And I grew up not only what you can see, but very differently from that. It's also probably the first time that I was exposed to even the notion of a kind of class, and privilege wasn't a word we used back then. And, I was thrust in a really, really different environment. And just, to really make the point real, it's interesting because when I first started at McKinsey, the definition of a diverse hire was somebody from Harvard Law School instead of Harvard Business School, right? It was that homogenous, if you will. And so certainly allyship was not in our vocabulary. Mentorship was. So the way I relate to it is around mentorship. I also relate to allyship, and I could give examples of these, as basic kindness. And sometimes, that just sounds so basic, but I'll share my experience with just kindness. And another way I benefited was somebody taking a chance on me. And so sort of going backwards, and these are things you only see on reflection and hindsight. The chance on me was, I actually started at UCLA. I transferred to UC San Diego, where I graduated from. I think, I was certainly an unusual hire for McKinsey at the time. The reason I think I stood out is because I'd worked full-time through my whole undergraduate since I was 15 years old. And there was, and he's still a friend and mentor of mine to this day, 30 something years later, oh my gosh, I'm gonna scare myself. That's a long time. He was a white gentleman that grew up with a single mother in a low income environment. And he saw something in me, right? That work ethic, that drive, the need to provide. And he stood up in the hiring process and said, I believe this is someone we should take a chance on. So to me, that was a tremendous form of allyship that certainly changed the trajectory of my life in terms of opportunity. The second and the simple one that I said around kindness, I was 21 years old. I'm terrified. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm in this environment, and one day I'm just walking down the hall past one of the senior partners' offices, and office, and he just calls me, and he's like this, gray-haired, again, like white gentleman, gray-haired guy, and just comes in and says, hey, my wife and I, we spent some time, we lived in Japan for a few years, and I'd love to talk to you about some of that. And he literally just had a conversation with me. It was probably 10 minutes long. But all of a sudden, it's like that, for him, it was just like he was just interested. For me, it was such an act of kindness that it's like he opened the door, but it was almost like he opened the universe, in a way. That sounds kind of dramatic, but it's like these like little moments. And it's funny that, again, like 30 something years later, I think to those moments as being really pivotal in what were either seeds of allyship, seeds of mentorship, seeds of caring, seeds of being seen for who I am and as a person, that made all the difference in terms of how I benefited. And Terence, I don't know, I'm going a bit long, so I could certainly give
please,
examples.
Great, yeah.
Okay, so so I won't go into examples of where when I've seen, so later in my career, not even out of a conscious sense of reciprocation as much as desire, when I see someone special, I pluck them out, right? And I become a mentor to them. I mean, I've got mentees that I've had, they're really friends now, for 20 years as I've seen them grow through their career. And on a more systematic basis, I'll give an example of when I was at Yahoo. It was a big operating role. And my executive team all had chief of staff. And the chief of staff kept the trains running, they did the presentations, they kept the executives organized, et cetera. And I noticed, they were always invited to all the executive meetings. And I noticed the chief of staff never spoke. And there was a disproportionate share of them that were women and that were women of color. And I noticed they were always, they did all the work. They did the presentations, they did the analysis, they got the executives to show up. And in the room, the executives all spoke. And even in that environment where it was a very low risk environment, I noticed that these younger women of color would not speak out unless they were specifically called on. And so I started having regular lunches with different groups of people, but this particular group of people, because they're so high potential, they're so talented, so hardworking, they're going to do great things in their life. And as an example, we would watch a TED Talk by Amy Cuddy, the Fake It Till You Make It video, which if you guys haven't seen, you guys should check it out. It's very powerful. And just this notion of owning your space, having agency over yourself. It's okay to be present in the room. And in fact, that will become the expectation. But showing that kind of sort of coaching, even in a group setting, has been really important for me as a way to give back.
I really appreciate the practical examples of active allyship. And what I really appreciated about what you shared, Mickey, is a reminder for me, and I hope for everyone here, that sometimes I think we think of allyship as this really big thing that we have to do, but sometimes allyship is in the really small acts as well, right? Helping those who aren't often seen feel seen, those who aren't often heard feel heard and valued. And so that was an incredible example. Thank you. Tonya, would you like to chime in here, and then I'll go on to the next question.
Yeah, and everything that my former panelists shared gave me a lot of ideas. I was taking some notes, some things I wanted to share, but I think that I come from a different background. I grew up in Hayward, from a working class family. My dad was a factory worker. My mom was a secretary when I was growing up, and I think that my sister was the first in our family to graduate from college. And initially, my first experiences with allyship were actually more formal programs that I was invited to, like Management Leadership for Tomorrow helped me get my first Google internship. And then my first kind of full-time job at Goldman Sachs. And then later on, you join women's groups, you join kind of advocacy groups, and all of those groups were really helpful. But as I started to progress in my career, I realized that a lot of these groups weren't enough still, and you still needed additional allies to help you kind of get to the next level. And especially in my line of work, I'm a tech entrepreneur. I have to raise venture capital. And, you know, as a Latina, as a first gen, you know, women in general receive less than 2% of venture capital. Latina women, you know, raise even less. And so statistically, I don't really even exist. It's like a rounding error. And so I really had to rely on allies. And to give you an example of how allies really helped in this scenario, you know, our first investor was a close friend of mine, or like a friend of a friend that, you know, was introduced to me. And, you know, my friend was a huge advocate. She was actually a UC San Diego PhD student that I did research under. And so she knew kind of my quality of work. She knew my work ethic. She was like, look, she really, really advocated for me. And that's what helped us get our first outside investor. And then, to be honest, our next lead investor came from a cold email. So someone reached out to us, and, you know, I recognized his name. He was like a prominent tech person, and, you know, he just cold emailed us, and I kind of took the chance and took a meeting with him. And you know, other ways that people have been advocates and allies are, and I think what Mickey shared is just being kind, but also being an advocate for you, and sometimes hyping you up more than you hype yourself up. I think is like something that I have realized that a lot of allies and mentors and kind of supporters have done for us. And like people nominating me for like Forbes 30 under 30, which opened up a ton of opportunities once I won that award. And so in my experience, I've had to learn to accept and, like, you know, sometimes not be so suspicious of people that want to help, because sometimes you see like this cold email from this prominent person, you're just like, okay, well, what's the catch? Why are they reaching out? But I think sometimes being open to that, and I think that especially as a woman of color, as you enter these spaces, there is this feeling of otherness. So, you know, on the other side of the spectrum, I would attend an event. I would literally be sometimes the only woman, sometimes the only person of color. And I would get questions sometimes like, you know, what does it feel like to be the only woman here? And it's like, you know, I'm in a room with 60 other dudes. I don't really want to answer this question, but you know, so I think that sometimes that means picking your battles, accepting help, but sometimes understanding that sometimes people don't have that same understanding of like what you're going through and the anxiety of being the only woman in a room. You know, sometimes people don't fully understand what that means. And I think sometimes being kind of just like having that perspective and then understanding how to set boundaries, how to communicate some of these emotions in a way that doesn't kind of, you know, that doesn't create a worse situation for you. I think is important. And so, yeah, those are some initial thoughts on this, but yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on allyship, and honestly, I'm super grateful for all of the allies that have helped me throughout my career. And I wouldn't have been able to come this far if it hadn't been for allies.
Yeah, thank you for sharing it. You know, Margaret in chat says, I feel you on this otherness, and I do as well. I'll say that much. You know, I think the three of you have already shared some practical tips and much of your experiences with allyship as well. But I really want the audience today to leave with a toolkit around how they can practice active allyship in the workplace, in their communities. Are there other examples of allyship that you can share from your own workplace, yourselves as leaders, other leaders that you have worked with and admired? Anything else you can share around specific things that you've noticed around allyship?
Sure, I'll happy to jump in. Our business today is largely data, and so I operate our business based on data and working with people and trying to build a diverse universe of opinions and worldviews is largely the same using data to understand what the workforce has to offer you. And so I'm constantly looking at my fellow employees, my workforce data, and understand who I have. And what I would say to those who aspire to be leaders in organizations or are leaders in organizations, there is a push, particularly with public companies and in private equity today, around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're starting to hear this a lot more. And diversity, even back in my days at the Walt Disney Company in the 1990s and the early 2000s, was an initiative. I wouldn't characterize it as a large initiative, and I'm not sure that it was defined the right way, but I would encourage people to embrace these things before they have to, and embrace it in an authentic manner. So those that are leaders today, those who aspire to be leaders, embrace that. It's not a challenge. It's our obligation as human beings. And I also encourage those who I work with to join me in the organization that I work very closely with, to coach and mentor high school students in underserved communities, an organization called the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, which I'm very passionate about. And I work with those young people the same way, in much the same way that I work with employees and fellow employees and people around me. Try to understand them, have an authentic relationship, understand their roadblocks, understand their challenges, understand their aspirations, their dreams, their goals, and ask questions. Don't go in and prescribe how things need to be, but ask. Again, asking questions is something that for me has been an evolution over the last 40 or so years, and it's served me well, and it has served those around me well. So I would encourage everybody to think in that way.
Yeah, I mean, maybe jumping on, what Ben started with, I think about allyship, and Terence, I know your question was specific examples, and I'll get to one, is I think systematic changes take place from a top-down level, a bottoms-up, and we should not discount the sideways, right? And I think, Tonya, you might have touched a bit on that, kind of the notion of sort of sideways help as well. The one area that I see a lot of, because I do serve on public boards, is the importance of ESG. So environmental, social, and governance, and that boards are being held accountable around ESG standards. And obviously there's a bunch under ESG, but one element is around creating not only safe, but positive, prosperous, encouraging work environments. Inclusivity and diversity are really very important. And I could tell you as a board member, and I see this a little more in Australia than even the US, but in addition to annual reports, we produce ESG reports, because increasingly the investment community are holding boards and companies accountable for these initiatives. And Ben mentioned this in the context of his own company, but the kinds of initiatives that we have, the kinds of targets that we have, the scorecard that we're achieving as an organization. And so the one thing that I would encourage is, while I think public companies are increasingly being pushed to do these things, I think each of us in our own environments, whether it's in smaller company environments or the educational environments or our own team environments, I think those are things that we can establish to help drive some of that top-down change, in addition, again, to some of the bottoms-up and sideways that we've touched on.
Yeah, I love everything that.
Yeah, Tonya, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say I loved everything that people shared so far. I especially asking the questions and listening, I think is key. I even think about that in my own work as I want to create more of an inclusive environment. And one thing that I would say that I want to make sure that I share here is I think like rethinking like being very specific, rethinking the way that you think about salary negotiations. There's been a few viral posts that have come out of, you know, one recruiter said that she didn't have the time to tell, to educate the candidate that she could have, she accepted an offer that was $50,000 lower than what the budget was. And so I think that when it comes to negotiations, especially like salary negotiations, as you're hiring people, I think that reframing that and thinking more about just offering people more money if they end up lowballing themselves. Like that's what I tend to do sometimes. I hired a consultant. She said that her rate was X amount and our budget for it and the market value was actually 3X that amount. So I actually was like, well, okay, well, thank you for sharing your rate. We're actually going to pay you this rate because that was more market value. And I think that that's where the industry should go, where I think that salary negotiations historically have benefited those that are like, are comfortable, have this culture around negotiating. And I think that some of it is not just advocating for other people, but actually just like telling them, you can educate them and take that time, but you can also just say, hey, we actually had budgeted for this amount, so we're going to put you in this like salary bracket instead. So I would encourage other leaders and organizations to rethink how they think about their salary brackets and negotiations, especially because I think that's what perpetuates the wealth gap, especially for women and people of color that traditionally haven't been taught at home how to negotiate and how to potentially advocate for themselves. And in general, I think this happens across like first generation college grads. So that's one thing that I wanted to definitely share. I think the other side is, I think that creating communities, I think can be really powerful. So creating dinner series, having more kind of informal ways to get to know each other outside of work, I think can be really powerful. I intentionally join some of these founder communities that have a mix of people, and they don't all look like me, but I think that it definitely helps everyone stretch outside of their kind of comfort zone. And so, yeah, so those are some things that I've been thinking about a lot, especially as we are hiring more, kind of rethinking, like there's some other founders that have shared with me that they actually have a policy at their organizations that they don't negotiate. So they actually just offer what they think is fair. And so I think rethinking that piece, I think can have a really big impact too.
I think that's brilliant. It goes, it's part of what I was saying as well, but data is blind, right? And those seeking a job or a promotion or to do something, get the data and use that to support your case. And as an employer, use the data. You don't look at a person, you look at their qualifications. Use the data to make things as they should be. And as Mickey was talking about ESG and DEI reporting, which is a big part of my life today as well. Embrace that, because the data is helpful in identifying opportunities in your business, in your life, in your organization, those things around you. And I really do believe that.
I also really appreciated that example, Tonya, because many of us have seen that illustration around equity, right, where these three individuals are trying to watch a baseball game over a fence, and they're standing on different sized crates, right, and that's supposed to illustrate the privilege that they've had relative to one another in life. And what you just gave an example of by saying, let's just be really transparent about salaries. Let's pay people what they are worth. But that was an example of, to me, is tearing down the fence, right? Why do we need the fence there in the first place? I love that, a very powerful example. What I want to ask you all now, Mickey was talking about elevating the voices of women and others who are marginalized in the workplace. And I'm curious, how does one amplify the voices of marginalized communities without overshadowing their voices? Any thoughts on that?
When I think about others that I just, I'll give the example of how others have done that in the past that I think have, I've found to be really, really helpful. There's been, and I think a perfect example is like people nominating others for different awards. Because I think that especially, the Forbes 30 under 30 was life-changing. I think for me, it opened up so many opportunities, but I wouldn't have gotten there if I hadn't, if there hadn't been a few people that had nominated me. I don't even know who did actually, to be honest. I didn't apply for it and I didn't ask anyone to nominate me, but someone just did it out of the blue. And so I think that sometimes doing these random acts of kindness, I think can be really helpful. Sending that cold email to that person that you think has a lot of potential, I think can be a life-changing moment. And that can actually accelerate, the growth of something in a meaningful way. And I think that part of it, and what I think about a lot too, is sometimes the advice that I receive, I need to take with a grain of salt, because I'll give you a quick example. I get a lot of fundraising advice and a lot of like business advice, and especially when it comes to fundraising, sometimes the way that I say something will be taken differently than if a tall white man from Stanford or Harvard will say it. And that's just like the reality that I have to face, that like the way that I communicate something will be interpreted differently. And I think that understanding that and knowing that it's not just so easy to just say this and it'll work out and it'll be perfect. It's just not the reality that I live in. And I've accepted that as like, it is what it is. I need to adjust and fully understand how that's going to be perceived prior to taking some of this advice. But I think that from an ally's perspective, I think understanding that it's not one-to-one sometimes. Like you can say something, you can act a different way, you can ask for that promotion, and sometimes that's not going to be taken in the same way. And sometimes you have to adjust some of the language in order to, receive in order to accomplish the goal. Or sometimes you have to go in a different direction in order to accomplish the goal because of the way you look, or because of pattern matching, or because of whatever exists. I think that sometimes it's not one-to-one, and I think fully understanding that, I think, is important.
Thank you.
One thought that I had as Tonya speaking is, and as I was thinking about this talk, this notion of agency, I think, is really an important one. And often the amplification comes from encouraging agency in others, and that we do ultimately have to own, right, like who we are, where we are, inform ourselves, and have the agency to step up and out wherever we can. And that includes, by the way, finding mentors and allies inside the workplace, outside the workplace. And I think part of that agency, and one thing that I would encourage all of us, and especially since this is in the setting of UCSD, is how do we educate and inform people who may not necessarily have the background. So when Tonya was speaking, when she shared her background, I came from a low-income community to immigrant parents who didn't speak English, certainly weren't educated here. And I just didn't know anything. And I didn't have places where I can learn some of those things. And certainly, and I'm not sure what career and alumni resources there are specifically at this point, but a lot of it is information, right? So it's the combination of educating, informing, understanding context, because there's also just like context, like Tonya said, right? Like, it's not only your race or gender or sexual orientation or whatever in context, but it's also just the context of where you are in your career, right? And how much credibility you have, what you can ask. And, so there is the education, the information, and then giving people agency within context to be able to really step into their own wholly, right? And be viewed for everything that they can bring to the table. So, I see, again, like those components as being all really important as well, including that self-agency as a really important component.
And Ben, as you chime in, Ben, I know you're gonna add to this conversation. I want to ask you, because a question came in from chat, and the question is, I'm a new intern. This is my first job. How do I go about finding an ally? And so, can you add that to your response as well, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure. First of all, I would say that the word that Mickey used, agency, I think it's pretty brilliant. And I think it's analogous to helping others develop their own confidence. And what was said at the very beginning of this session around small acts of kindness, recognizing somebody's abilities in not necessarily some grand fashion. I think those add up over time, and those are, I think, far more significant, far more memorable, far more useful to anybody who is developing agency or building their own confidence to do the things that they need and can do. How do you find a good mentor? That is, you've got to have a filter for sure. I think that Tonya pointed out, that she oftentimes, and I think is the right approach, take a lot of advice, unsolicited advice, with a grain of salt. And those seeking a good mentor need to cast a wide net. Don't limit yourself to where you work or go to school or your close circle of friends, but it really does come down to networking and really getting to know people authentically, not transactionally, but getting to know people authentically. I don't know that there is, at least in my frame of reference, in my life, that there was a formula for finding a good mentor. Quite frankly, in the early part of my career, I was terrible at finding mentors, and then did build some traction and momentum as I matured in my career. I still look for them today, but I look for people, for myself, those that have experiences that I want to know about, have done things that I'm interested in, have sometimes similar tastes or interests, but oftentimes not. I think even diversity in interests make a better mentor. But I don't know that you can go to Google and find, Google, how do I find a good mentor? Everybody's got an opinion, right? And a lot of people are opinionated about how you do it. But I think that you really have got to create your own filter, understand yourself and what your aspirations are, and match them up. And there's no Tinder for mentors either. And I sometimes wish there was 40 years ago, but there isn't.
Tonya, I saw you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh, Tonya, go ahead.
I saw Tonya nodding a lot, so that's why I thought you might have something to add. But go ahead, Mickey, then I'll come to Tonya.
Yeah, no, I could relate to a lot of what Ben was saying as well, and kind of looking at it from both sides. I have to say, as somebody who's more sort of later in her career now, if a random person asks me, like, can you be my mentor? It's a little, I have to say, it's a little random, right? Because there isn't the point of connection, and there's only so many people that, in terms of like specific mentorship of specific individuals, And in my experience, both as a mentor, but also as a mentee, the number one thing in my experience is for someone to stand out, right? And standing out can be doing either like incredible work or showing a drive or a work ethic or showing an intellectual curiosity or just curiosity in general or asking questions, a hunger, you know. And I think about, I'll just give a specific example. When I was at Fox, I was on the founding team of what became Hulu. And I work with the most senior person, Peter Chernin, and a very respected, revered executive in the media industry. And he was a big visionary and champion of what ultimately became Hulu. And, you know, all I know is I was working 100 hours a week on my various responsibilities, including Hulu. And he got to know me through my work. And there must have been a many year gap, like a 7 or 8 year gap. And my first public board opportunity came up with Pandora Media because he was on the board and he put my name in the hat because he remembered, right? And I do consider him to be a mentor and a coach, but it came through that work and that work connection. And likewise, some of the people that I mentioned earlier that I've kind of, when I say pluck out, it's not that deliberate at the time. It's only in hindsight where you're like, wow, like, you know, this guy's so cool. And, you know, I just see something special in him and, or in her. And, you know, I have both mentees that are men, women, all races. It's not particularly specific to being like a, you know, an Asian woman or anything like that. But it's like I see a seed of something in them and a seed of potential, right? Because something sparks. So it's not, so again, like I think there's certainly nothing wrong with trying to build those connections, but it often comes from something within. And so the one thing that I can't overemphasize is how important, you know, working hard, delivering, being that reliable person, going the extra mile. And, you know, Tonya talked a little bit about different perception, external perceptions. There are times when as a woman or a person of color or different sexual orientation or whatever it is, where you have to go above and beyond because we all have like, right, like sort of our own filters on how we see the world. And sometimes it means going above and beyond, or often I would argue. And I feel like certainly I was that person. And when I see those people, those are the ones that I want to invest in as a mentor.
You know, I would want to, I was just thinking through this as Mickey was talking. I also don't think mentors necessarily have to be a gray beard like myself. You know, it's somebody with 30 or 40 or 50 years worth of experience. I have a mentor now who I used to mentor myself. I worked with him very closely. I was his mentor when he was starting his technology business 15 years ago, which is now enormously successful. And I see brilliance in him and the people he has put around himself and how he manages his organization. And I now use him. That this young man, I can say young man, is 15 years younger than me, and he is super helpful to me in managing through just the issues that we've all faced over the last 2 years. Those of us who are part of small or large organizations and all of the challenges that have come with operating them and managing people or interacting with people over the last 2 years. He has mentored me in how to do that with my team.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to the sort of bi-directional nature of mentorship, right? The mentor and the mentee benefits from that relationship. I want to ask you, and I think we're also seeing the connection between mentorship and allyship, right? I think that's been a running theme throughout the hour. I'm often asked, though, how can I become a better ally for communities, right? I'm not Black, but I sympathize with the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to help that particular movement. Or, I'm not Asian, but I also want to stop Asian hate. And, I'll tell you that one of my principles, and I want to hear yours as well, is that we first have to start with listening, right? Listening, I feel like it can't be said enough that really the single most important thing that we can do to be better allies for and with members marginalized communities is to listen and listen across difference, right? And do our homework, watch those documentaries, have those uncomfortable conversations. But what are your lessons that you can share with us around, how we can be better allies for entire communities of marginalized individuals?
I'm going to chime in here. And I also want to share a little bit about the mentor piece
Great.
too, but I'll answer your first question on, I do think that it's important for allies to do their own research and own education on the space. So like literally watching YouTube videos on some of these topics, and like, because I think that oftentimes it's the marginalized person's responsibility to not just deal with the interactions, but also educate, set boundaries and things like that. And I think that a lot of that can be solved if people literally just start Googling, like, how can I be a better ally for women? How can I, ways to support, like, I think that literally doing the research and doing some of the reading, Twitter is great too. Speaking to your mentees about, and listening to them and asking them questions, I think is important too. And I've seen that happen both ways. Like I've had great mentors of mine ask questions, do the research, say like, hey, I actually read this. What do you think about it? Would love to hear your thoughts on this. And I think that engaging in some of these conversations can lead to a lot of growth. And on the mentor side, I did want to say one thing that I think that was left unsaid, was that I think that sometimes people early in their careers think that they need like one main mentor, like one person that's going to guide them throughout life. That doesn't exist. You need, honestly, you need like 10 mentors to get through life or more. Like, so I think that just build your roster, build your team of mentors, and it's not going to be one person. It shouldn't be one person that you rely on. It should be, the one person that helps you with negotiations, the one person that helps you with funding, the one person that helps you with your mental health, the one person. So I think that building this team, I think, is really, really important. And I think I wanted to share an example of how, and going back to one of the questions that Amanda shared on the chat, of like a specific example of how I was successfully able to get a mentor, where I reached a point in my career where I felt, very much like I didn't have the right team in place, right? The right people that I wanted to counsel on in the point in my career. So I actually reached out to a few of my existing networks and said, look, I'm putting together a dinner series of Latina leaders in New York City, and please send me any names of like prominent leaders in this space that I can connect with. And I got some of the best recommendations, and two of those resulted in, people that directly invested in my, my next company. And then, going the extra mile, I not only brought together this, this group of Latina leaders, but I also got it sponsored by a magazine. I created kind of a conversation topic around it so that everyone could connect. And then I was able to connect other people to each other, because also other Latina leaders were looking for other people that they could connect with too. So I think that going that extra mile, creating these initiatives, creating community, being consistent, and honestly just doing the work sometimes and being open to other people. I didn't go out and say, will you be my mentor? I said like, okay, I'm creating this dinner series. I happened to connect really well with a few of the people there. And then I started to, I ended up having like long-term kind of friendships and relationships with them. So just wanted to share that story too.
And I think that's a great example. And it's that approach that changes communities. I encourage people to take a stand. Don't keep your point of view to yourself. Don't keep your perspective to yourself. Sometimes it's risky, but make your view known, because that will attract others who are like-minded, who are kindred spirits to you, and you'll be able to bond together like Tonya has and make real change.
I want to give everyone a chance for a final word here. I'm looking at the time, and unfortunately, we're coming up on the hour. Mickey, can I start with you?
Well, I feel like I've shared a lot given the time that we've had. I mean, I do feel like, we have such a long way to go as a society, as a culture. But at the same time, I feel like we are in a good time when a lot of the, even this very conversation is taking place. And the one thing that I love even about today is how much like I've learned, right? And some of the ideas, and also the, I'm inspired to do more and think differently and maybe a little more practically. I mean, Tonya certainly talked about a lot of initiatives that she's taken. And so I do feel like it's an ongoing journey for each of us in both how we can hopefully lead in certain cases, but also learn. And to Ben's point, right, like I also have cases where some of my mentees have become my mentors, and there's like a whole full circle element to this. And we should just like continuously be curious, learn, and contribute as we can.
Ben, thank you. Ben. Oh,
I'll follow that.
yeah, sure.
You're on mute. I was waiting for that. I think the number one phrase from 2020. But anyways, I'm very envious of those who are in their, I would say, late educational phase, early career phase, that this is happening now. I wish I had the ability to have this conversation 40 years ago, or quite frankly, even 15 years ago. And I share Mickey's opinion that it is tremendous that it is happening now. Sometimes, unfortunately, for the wrong reasons, but with the right results. We have a long way to go, though. Across the spectrum, we have a long way to go, and I encourage everybody to engage in this as you go forward in your careers. I don't see anything as more important from a societal standpoint than what we're talking about today, because it is so far-reaching in how it affects people's lives and how it affects the generations that will come well after us. So engage and listen.
Thank you. Tonya, you have the last word.
All the pressure. No, it was great. I'm really happy about all of the points that were made here. I think that the last thing I'll share is actually I wanted to plug my company Snowball Wealth, and if anyone that has debt or student debt and is tackling it, please share it. I actually got a DM around building a mentorship program and a mentorship team, and the best way to do the outreach. And I'll just share my experience in this, and at least people that have reached out to me. I think that making it, well, first, I think casting a wide net, but I think also being really targeted about your outreach. So for example, I was asked to be a mentor for young female entrepreneurs. And the email that I was sent actually had like a photo of my potential mentees could look like. And I was like, okay, I have to sign up for this. I'm sorry. There's no way I could say no. So I think that being really targeted, I think that like Mickey shared, sometimes you want to contribute positively to the future. And I think doing a wide outreach and being really targeted and specific, I think can go a really long way.
Well, Tonya, Ben, Nikki, thank you for leading the way. Thank you for inspiring me and everyone hopefully here today. I certainly learned a lot from the three of you. It was really a pleasure. I hope you all learned a lot as well. And thank you for joining us. This is the 5th annual, I heard, Triton Leaders Conference, and I hope to see you all again next year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of the day. We do have another session this afternoon, but it was wonderful to have everybody.
Good seeing you all. Let's
Take
stay in
care.
touch.
Thank you.
Bye.